So this is the new Google Pixel Watch 4. And they've been putting it through its paces over the last little while, running and cycling and more cycling, even a little bit of swimming, just to see where it works well and where it falls short. Now, I'm gonna dive into the tech specs very quickly here before we get into all the goodness, because there's a lot of goodness here, but there's also a number of things that leave me a little bit puzzled. Now, the very first thing to know here is a new display. This display is now 50% brighter, up to 3000 nits. It is also 10% bigger from a screen standpoint and has 16% smaller bezels on the outside of the display. One of the common complaints about the Pixel Watch has always been the bezels being a bit large. Now they're less large. Also notably, the screen itself is now curved. In the past, just this top cover was curved and the screen was flat and it kind of had a curved look to it once you put the two together. But now the screen itself is curved. Now, outside of having this two side by side, you'd probably never notice. And you certainly wouldn't notice unless I told you, but it is kind of nice when you do see it side by side. Now, next up, they've increased the haptic motor or the vibration motor inside this by 15%. Again, you wouldn't notice unless I told you, and it's not something I noticed over the last little while in testing. Next up, they've changed the speaker in here. Now, it's not louder than in the past, technically speaking. Instead, they've tuned that speaker to be more applicable to voice, in particular the Gemini AI assistant they have on this watch, so that you can hear that voice a little more clearly. Speaking of hearing things a little more clearly, if you could just watch this video to the end, that is the only thing the YouTube gods care about these days, and we need to make sure they are clear about what to care about. Now, next up is an updated dual chipset architecture that they're saying is 25% faster, but also saves 50% power. Now, from a UI standpoint, I didn't really notice too much of a difference in day-to-day tasks. Certainly, there are certain things you can put side by side and compare them, but day-to-day, again, you're not going to notice this either, but you will notice the battery savings. So from a battery standpoint, they've increased the battery claims. I can see right at the bottom there. It's about 25% longer than it has been in the past, and I'm now noticing that difference. You can see that in terms of getting basically 2 full days out of this without any problems on the 45mm anyways. However, notably, there is no GPS claims at all from Google, which is really bizarre, to be honest. Like, every company out there, even Apple, has GPS claims for their battery life, but they don't here. Nonetheless, in my testing over countless activities, longer activities, etc., I'm seeing battery burn that puts it at roughly 14 to 15 hours of GPS on time. So if you had a full battery on this, you would get 14 to 15 hours. Speaking of charging, they have a new charging dock here. Yet again, Google has like a new charging dock every single year for their Pixel watches. It's just, I think that's come from like the Fitbit realm where they had new chargers all the time. In any case, a new charging dock here. It is way faster than the past, and I appreciate that. That all works well. It's also magnetic and it stays put. Like, you can swing this thing around without any issues and it holds tight. The only downside of this is that the cable itself is physically attached permanently to that dock. If you're traveling, it's kind of nice just to be able to have like little adapters and plug a USB-C cable into it and call it done. The reason Google didn't do that, though, is I said that they were concerned people would have crappy USB-C cables and wouldn't get fast charging, which, to be fair, there are a lot of crappy USB-C cables out there. The good news, though, is that Google has their Made for Google program, and with that, they've actually certified a few of those standalone chargers that you can find already. I'll put a link down to them on Amazon there, that basically will do exactly that. You just supply your own USB-C cable. I think the most important thing on this watch is actually battery serviceability, of all things. You can change the battery on the Pixel Watch yourself, which is crazy. Now, that's being heavily driven by new EU regulation coming into effect here shortly, which will require user serviceable, user replaceable batteries from tech devices. And Google is the first smartwatch company to do that. So the way this works is you take out a T2 Torx wrench or Torx screwdriver. They are super cheap. You can find like a pack of an entire kit of them for under 10 bucks on Amazon. And then you simply remove the band and pop out the screws on both sides to remove the battery, and then eventually replace it with a battery that's provided by Google. Now, some of you may be thinking, hey, this means they're going to overcharge me a bunch for this battery, but actually the EU covers that too. In the regulations, Google has to provide that battery for a reasonable price, basically the price that they would get the battery for. So there shouldn't be any scenario where they're charging you like 150 bucks for a battery that otherwise just means you're going to buy a new watch. So super cool stuff there. Now, right now, you can't buy that battery because obviously the watch just came out, and Google says they'll get to that, but at the moment, there shouldn't be any reason for anyone to be replacing a battery. This is not designed for just swapping batteries like on a long weekend. This is designed for when the battery degrades or otherwise needs to be replaced. Then the next really big ticket item on this is satellite connectivity. Google was the very first company to announce satellite connectivity on a smartwatch, in particular two-way satellite connectivity. Obviously, smartwatches have been connecting to GPS for a long time, but two-way satellite connectivity means that it can send messages to a satellite when you're outside of cellular connectivity range. So think deep in the mountains, etc. That's important here because it allows you to do emergency SOS assistance requests. So if you're out in the mountains, you're out of cellular range, a bear attacks you, you fall down a cliff, or whatever the case may be, you can now use your watch to basically go ahead and point it at the satellites and request emergency support. Now, there's a few requirements here to be aware of. The very first one is you have to have the LTE version of the Pixel Watch. You do not have to have LTE service enabled on it, but just the LTE version, because it has the updated antenna design in here that is otherwise used for LTE that they're basically reappropriating to use for the cellular side of bits. The next bit is you have to be within coverage range of the service today. As of filming this video, that is essentially just the US. So if you're in Europe, elsewhere, it's not going to work. In talking to Google, that is not a hardware restriction though. So down the road, they expect to expand beyond the US and the existing hardware will support that. Now, once all that's ready and you've been attacked by a bear, you can go ahead and place an emergency call. The first thing it's going to try to do is to use your existing connections, whether it be your cell phone, for example, or LTE on this, because that's going to be the best experience. If neither of those available, then it'll offer to escalate up to satellite SOS. At this point, it'll ask you what's wrong. Basically, it tries to get information about the incident first, so it can consolidate that into a single packet to send to the emergency response center. Once all that's set, it's going to walk you through how to point it at a satellite, and it's going to go ahead and connect to that satellite. Google is using Skylo as their satellite partner here. Skylo is a company that has like an umbrella over other satellites. So think of them kind of like a middleman for satellite services, and in particular, connecting to geo satellites. Geo satellites are geostationary over one spot on Earth. So in other words, this satellite might hang over like Colorado, just using a very basic example here, as opposed to LEO satellites, which are low Earth orbit satellites that are constantly moving around the world. This has its pros and cons. It means that they can guarantee coverage over a given area, but it also means that the satellite could be behind a mountain or something like that, and you might not be able to connect to it if it's blocking the view of your satellite. In any case, the connection process takes maybe like 30 to 60 seconds. I got a quick demo of this in real life. I can't obviously test this normally because it would escalate to emergency responders and send a helicopter, and I hadn't been attacked by a bear yet. Now at this point, it's actually connecting to the Garmin Emergency Response Center, otherwise known just simply as Garmin Response. That's the same center that handles Garmin's inReach devices and has been doing so for like 15 years or so. In fact, they actually just released a video yesterday talking about the numbers they've had, and it's been a couple 100,000 incidents over the years, something like 20,000 cases of sending emergency responders to places. Super impressive stuff. They also handle satellite requests from Google's phones as well as Samsung's phones. So this is not like their first barbecue. And they do that in 200 languages and all this stuff. The point there is, this is not a new thing. This has been around a long, long time, and Google's leveraging it, which is good for consumers because it means we're not like having a beta test anything here. Now, once all that happens, then they coordinate sending emergency response to you. That could be a helicopter, that could be people on the ground, etc. Whatever it is to get to your particular location. At the same time, they're also notifying emergency contacts that you've been attacked by a bear, and they're keeping those emergency contacts up to date on getting you away from the bear. Make sense? Cool. Now, all that's great, except one little problem for Google. Roughly a week later, Garmin also announced satellite connectivity on their Phoenix 8 Pro watches, and then a week after that, Apple announced it on their Apple Watch Ultra 3. And in the case of both Garmin as well as Apple, they announced more than just emergency response pieces. They also announced basically text messaging via satellite, so anywhere you had coverage, as well as the ability to track location. In Apple's case, Find My Updates, in Garmin's case, kind of a similar sort of thing, which means that Google's sort of left behind with 2/3 of the puzzle not there. When I asked Google about that, they said they are keenly aware of what their competitors are doing. And more importantly, they don't see this as the end point for the Pixel Watch and satellite connectivity, but for the start point. They also noted that the hardware in this watch is fully capable of doing both of those two things if and when Google were to roll it out, but that they couldn't comment on their exact rollout plans. I would, of course, expect Google will get to both of those features. Whether or not that's, say, like within the next year thing or beyond that is probably the bigger question here. Now, we're going to switch directions and go towards the sports realm. But first, a brief pit stop in sleep and skin temperature accuracy. Number one, they said they've gone ahead and increased the sensor on the back from a skin temperature standpoint. Sure, there isn't really any way to like validate or test that based on the way these companies do this because they just kind of show like increases and decreases, but not exact ranges. So I'll take their word for it. The other bit here is they said they've increased the sleep stage and phase accuracy detection. Again, as I've said in the past in other videos, there's also not a great way to test that either, because the way you would test a sleep phase and stage from an accuracy standpoint is only about 80 to 85% accurate to begin with. That's like the gold standard, which isn't all that great of a gold standard. So as a result, I'm just going to say that from an accuracy of when I fell asleep and when I woke up, that was good across the board. So I had no problems with that. The other bit that's actually not technically sports related, at least not yet, is a they've added Google Gemini into this. So that means that you have Google's Gemini as their AI assistant, and you can access it one of two ways. The first one is simply just raise your wrist up like this and just immediately ask Gemini the question that you want. And then the second one is to go ahead and open up the Gemini app on the watch. So when you do that, you can ask it whatever you want, and very similar to ChatGPT, is going to give you a very detailed and generally very accurate answer. For example, here's what it said when I asked about my initial Pixel Watch 4 preview post. This is a review, my preview post, and it did a great job of summarizing exactly what I said. Where things start to fall apart a little bit, though, is the integration into the sports and fitness realm. When I asked it a lot of different questions, like, for example, why my readiness score was oddly low for a while there, it couldn't answer that. It just simply said, generally speaking, here is why readiness scores were low, but not why my readiness scores were low. Likewise, anything I asked it about my sports stats or fitness stats, it just simply opened up the Fitbit app instead, as opposed to giving me the actual answers in the chat. In talking to Google about this is one of those areas they just simply haven't got to integrating it, but it sounds like it's definitely on the agenda. In fact, coming up over the next few weeks and months, Google's going to start rolling out a completely revamped version of the Fitbit app on your phone, which has Gemini like baked in the core. And Google talked a lot about this. I'm going to have a separate video about this down the road here, but that's different than a lot of other companies which may have like a AI chatbot in their app that's otherwise not really super connected. In the new Fitbit app, virtually every single detailed component of the app can be tapped on, and you can chat with AI about that particular component. Like, it is super impressive, at least from the demos I've seen. Again, real life experience coming up here very shortly in a separate video. Now, the next sports piece they've added here is bike mirroring or bike real-time streaming. That means that you have your watch here, you have your phone here, you put your phone on your handlebars, and you can stream your stats from your watch to your phone. Now, this is fairly similar to what a lot of other companies have done over the last 18 months or so, but I would say it's fairly limited. You can only see the one data page, you can't see Google Maps or other things like that, but it's a good start. This is primarily targeted at really the commuting realm, or if you're on a city bike or something like that, as opposed to really more like the sports oriented, where you're out doing a bunch of, long rides, etc. Certainly you can do that, but I think the target here is more kind of a general around town sort of thing. And that's why it's odd to me there is no Google Maps integration. Like, Google, you own Google Maps. Like, you own the entire mapping space, and you are so good at it. This should be core part of that experience, and unfortunately it's not here today. And in fact, while we're talking about the data pages from a sporting experience, we got to have a chat here. I think this is one gap that Google really needs to game up. The data page configuration you have just for any sports, running, etc., is pretty far now behind the times compared to others. I think you could have overlooked this in the past when Google wasn't really so much of a sport-focused device, but over the last couple of years, they've added a ton of sport features, but the data page customization here, the data fields, are very minimal. You get like one data page to customize. That's it. And just a handful of fields compared to their competitors. Google, you really need a game up in this particular area. The same goes for taking laps, for example. Right now you have to swipe to the right, then you tap the lap button. No one wants to do that when they're in the middle of the interval and dying. Like, that's just way too complex. So those sort of areas, the core like sports bits, now need to take a bit of a front seat to make them more competitive with, well, your competitors. Now, the next notable hardware upgrade for sports people here is the addition of dual frequency GPS or multi-band GPS. Multi-band or dual frequency GPS is considered like the holy grail of GPS because it allows for better accuracy, especially in really hard environments. So think like cities, downtown building areas, up against mountain cliffs, etc. And I did a bunch of testing of that. So starting off on the downtown kind of scenario, here is a whole bunch of tall buildings, about 20-story buildings I went through, and actually did a great job there. No problems at all. Likewise, in a bunch of trail running scenarios, no problems there at all. Even up against some cliffs and stuff, it was perfect. And then other cases while cycling in the mountains on switchbacks, it was great. But I also had a couple really strong failures here, in particular this ride right here, where it was really bad. So you see it's just like all over the place. In fact, on the watch itself, it was showing at times speed 0. I was going down at like 40, 50 kilometers an hour in these descents, and it would just say speed was 0. And I was like, well, this is wrong. So I went back to Google and asked what was up, and they then escalated. They pulled logs from my watch. So what they found is the watch was actually going to sleep by design in both cycling and walking, and in turn wasn't correctly churning on some of the different constellations and causing these GPS accuracy issues. And as a result, depending on where you are in the world, I'm in Europe, and this bug sounds like it may be limited more to Europe than the US, can have a very real effect on things in the cycling and walking mode, leading to pretty bad GPS accuracy. I suspect Google will figure out how to fix this, probably just by turning off some of the going to sleep bits that shouldn't be happening anyways during a workout, and hopefully things will get sorted out. The other side is heart rate accuracy. As with the past year, this was spot on, whether it be from an interval standpoint or regular runs or cycling workouts, indoors, outdoors, etc. I had no problems across the board. You can see this in a bunch of different charts right here, or you can see my full written review link down below there to dive into all those accuracy bits as well. I won't belabor it because it was really good, and so kudos there. Now, the last thing to mention before we get into the summary is the pricing is $349 for the smaller edition and $399 for the larger edition. And then if you want LTE, you add $100 to both of those. Keeping in mind, again, LTE hardware is the only way to access these satellite connectivity features, even if you don't end up enabling it on an LTE plan at all initially or even ever. It is nice to see that Google has kept their pricing from the past. That's the exact same pricing as last year, especially when you look at some of their competitors, which have increased their prices substantially over the last year or so. Okay, so where do we stand overall with the Pixel Watch 4? I think that's actually an interesting question because Google has made some really strong strides this year on this watch. A lot of little things. Some of them are big ticket things like adding satellite connectivity and adding Gemini, etc. But just a lot of little things that are really well appreciated. But I think from a sports standpoint, they kind of took a little bit of a back seat this year compared to last year where they had huge sports updates like with cardio load and with structured training and kind of stuff like that. Versus this year, it's a little more subdued. And I feel like they might be falling behind some of the competitors from a sports standpoint, which can be fine depending on which lens you're viewing it in. Google has made a very competitive Android Wear OS-based watch and arguably the best one out there from a holistic standpoint. It is very, very good. The battery life is good. The overall polish is very good. However, I do feel like Google is still missing some element of excitement in this watch. I can see it in the views, I can see it in the interest level compared to the Samsung watches, for example. And I think it really comes down to the hardware design of this watch. For a portion of the population, potentially a really big portion of the population, just isn't what people are excited about. I think there's two things Google needs here. One, they need some sort of ultra-sized, ultra-category, ultra, whatever you want to call it watch. You don't need to call it ultra, you can call it something else, but it's a bit more beefy and a bit more effectively manly. That's what people have been asking for. It doesn't have to be for men. It just has to be for something that want a bigger, more statement-oriented watch, and they don't have that today. And then when it comes to the base version, there are a lot of people that like this round, simple watch, but there's also a lot of people that want something a bit more exciting that simply adding additional bands isn't solving for. And again, that's the feedback that I'm hearing over and over and over again, and I've heard for 4 years now. So I'm hoping when we get to Google Pixel Watch 5, they'll make some changes there. Even if they keep an option that looks like this, I think having other styles of watches would be super helpful to the Google Pixel Watch from a sales standpoint. And ultimately, as a consumer, you want them to sell watches, otherwise they will stop updating watches like this and become disinterested. So that's my 2 cents on it. Again, definitely hit the subscribe button at the bottom there for plenty more sports technology goodness. There is still a whole lot more to come here over the next couple of days and weeks, and plenty more watches as well. With that, have a good one.